Red Rock Canyon had always been a land carved by wind, by sun, and by hardship. A place where the earth cracked under its own heat, and where every living thing survived only by grit and stubbornness. But for one young woman, this unforgiving stretch of desert wasn't just a home, it was the last piece of a life she once knew. Clara Dawson. A widow far earlier than she ever should have been. Her husband's grave rested on the hill overlooking the ranch, a quiet reminder of everything she'd lost. She visited it every morning not out of ritual but because in a place as lonely as Red Rock Canyon, it was the closest thing she had to company. And each day as she looked out over the valley she made the same silent promise: she would not let their legacy die. But promises didn't come easy in Red Rock Canyon. This land was coveted, jealously, desperately, by men who believed they could take whatever they wanted. Outlaws drifted through these parts like hungry wolves, watching, waiting, testing the fences of every ranch they passed. And circling even closer were the ranchers who wanted Clara's land for themselves, men who had smiled at her husband when he was alive, and sharpened their knives the moment he was gone. Clara knew eyes were on her. She felt it in the stillness. She heard it in the silence between the winds. She sensed it in the way strangers lingered a little too long when they passed her gate. The canyon had a way of swallowing the weak. And now that she stood alone, many believed she was easy prey. But Clara Dawson had more iron in her heart than anyone realized. Even so, she could not yet see the danger closing in. Because the threats gathering around her weren't just the usual thieves and drifters. No. Something else was moving beneath the surface. Something calculated. Something patient. And it had begun long before her husband drew his final breath. There were secrets buried in Red Rock Canyon. Secrets her husband never had the chance to tell her. Secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. And Clara, standing alone on land soaked in her family's sweat, was about to be caught in the middle of it all. In the coming days she would question everything she thought she knew about the ranch, about her husband's death, and about the dark forces tightening around her. She believed she was defending her home. But she was stepping into a battle far bigger, far older, and far deadlier than she could have imagined. Because in Red Rock Canyon, nothing stayed buried forever. And for Clara Dawson, the threats coming her way were only just beginning. Her name was Clara Dawson. Long before she became a widow, long before the canyon turned hostile, Clara and her husband carved their lives into the red earth with their own hands. They arrived in Red Rock Canyon when it was little more than open land and whispered promises. A rundown shack, a patch of stubborn soil, and a dream that only the desperate would dare to chase. They built everything from scratch. Every fence post hammered by hand. Every acre cleared under the blaze of an unforgiving sun. Every victory earned inch by inch. There were years when the rain forgot they existed, when the sky cracked and the land turned to dust. There were months when their debts stacked higher than their hopes. And there were nights when the wind howled so violently that their small home groaned as if the canyon itself wanted to claw them back into the earth. But they endured. Clara and her husband stood side by side through it all, through droughts that emptied their wells, through dust storms that swallowed the horizon, through lean winters when they had to choose between feeding themselves or feeding the livestock that kept the ranch alive. They learned to fight the land, respect it, and live by its harsh rules. And slowly, painfully, the ranch began to grow. It wasn't large, not compared to the spreads owned by the old ranching families. But it was theirs. Every corral, every trail, every grazing patch carried the weight of their sweat and their stubborn hope. For Clara, the ranch wasn't just land, it was a history written in calloused hands and quiet resilience. But all of that changed in a single day. Her husband's riding accident happened on the far ridge, an ordinary chore turned tragedy. Clara never saw him alive again. And when she stood over his grave, the earth freshly turned, she felt something worse than grief. She felt the shift. The way people looked at her changed. The way they spoke. The way they paused before asking a question. As if they were waiting for the ranch to become vulnerable. Waiting for Clara to break. Waiting for their chance. Because Clara had inherited more than a ranch. She inherited his debts. His enemies. His unfinished business. And the unspoken grudges simmering beneath the canyon's dusty surface. The land itself was valuable, far more valuable than Clara realized. Its pastures were fertile compared to the barren flats surrounding it. And the water, the spring that ran through her property was worth its weight in gold. In Red Rock Canyon, water meant power and power meant control. And powerful men had been watching. Some watched from a distance, hiding behind polite smiles and offers of help. Others lingered in the shadows, waiting for nightfall. The outlaw gang roaming the edges of the canyon hadn't come by accident. They weren't just wandering thieves. They were probing, testing boundaries, getting a sense of how defenseless the young widow might be. And then there was him. The rival rancher who paused just long enough to make Clara uneasy. A man known for swallowing up land, neighbor by neighbor, until his empire stretched farther than the eye could see. He didn't need to say a word, the hunger in his gaze said enough. Clara felt them all closing in, circling her like the canyon's hawks. She could sense their motives even if she didn't yet know the details. She could feel the pressure building, the unseen gears turning, the slow tightening of a trap she hadn't known existed. Her husband had tried to protect her from certain truths, about the ranch, about the land rights, about the men who wanted what belonged to them. He took some secrets to his grave. And now, Clara stood alone in the center of a quiet storm, one that had been gathering long before she ever sensed the wind. The battles ahead would not just test her strength, they would reveal the hidden forces shaping Red Rock Canyon, and the powerful enemies who had been waiting for a moment just like this. At first, the trouble came quietly. A cut fence here. A missing calf there. A set of unfamiliar boot tracks leading back toward Dry Creek Ridge, tracks made by men who didn't care if they were seen. Clara Dawson knew the signs. Everyone in Red Rock Canyon did. It was the unspoken language of intimidation, the slow tightening of pressure used on those too weak to fight back. Except Clara wasn't weak. And whoever was testing her resolve didn't yet understand who they were up against. But they would. Day by day the problems grew bolder. A gate left hanging open when she knew she had latched it herself. A water trough mysteriously emptied overnight. Fresh horse tracks circling the property, as if someone were measuring distance, studying blind spots, calculating their next move. These were no accidents. No coincidences. Someone was sending a message that said Clara's time on the ranch was coming to an end. But trouble doesn't always arrive with dust and hoofbeats. Sometimes it arrives wearing a clean hat and a friendly smile. That was how Samuel Briggs appeared one afternoon. He came riding down the road with the calm confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. He greeted Clara by name, spoke softly, and pretended to offer condolences for her husband's death, though his eyes held no sympathy at all. Then with that same polite tone, he offered to buy her out. He claimed he wanted to help her, to relieve her of the burden, to give her a fresh start, somewhere far from the hardships of the canyon. But a man like Samuel Briggs didn't make generous offers. He made acquisitions. He collected land, absorbed neighbors, spread his holdings like a wildfire that no one could outrun. And Clara's ranch, with its rich pastureland and reliable water, was the one piece he could never manage to get his hands on. Until now. Clara refused him without hesitation. Not because she was fearless but because she knew the truth. If Samuel Briggs got her land, the canyon would belong to him entirely. The smaller ranchers would lose their water. The outlaws would find shelter in his shadow. And Red Rock Canyon would fall under the grip of a man who believed ownership was the same as destiny. Briggs left calmly, tipping his hat as if they had simply discussed the weather. But Clara saw the flash of anger in his eyes, the kind a man hides when he's not used to hearing the word, no. And that was when the real trouble began. The outlaws grew reckless. They rode closer to the ranch than ever before, their silhouettes appearing at dusk like predators stalking prey. And then one evening they struck. A ranch hand of Clara's, an old friend of her husband's, was jumped while repairing a fence. Beaten, threatened, and left in the dirt with a warning meant for Clara. She got the message. But she didn't bend. She didn't sell. She didn't run. Instead, Clara stood on her porch that night with her husband's old rifle, staring out toward the horizon where trouble brewed. She could feel the canyon holding its breath around her, waiting to see whether she would break or fight. The forces tightening around her had underestimated her resolve. They believed a widow living alone could be pushed aside. They believed fear would win. They believed the ranch was already slipping from her grasp. But Clara Dawson was made of stronger steel than any of them realized. And as the threats escalated, as the shadows around her grew darker and more daring, one thing became unmistakably clear. Someone wanted her gone, and they were getting bold enough to try anything to make it happen. What they didn't know was that Clara had her own limits. And once those limits were crossed, she would not hesitate to strike back. The pressure was closing in. The danger was rising. And the storm gathering around Red Rock Canyon was only beginning to show its teeth. In the days that followed, something changed in Clara Dawson. Not in her posture. Not in her voice. But in the quiet, steady fire behind her eyes. Fear had tried to take root in her heart, but she refused to let it grow. The canyon had tested her before, its droughts, its storms, its long seasons of hunger and uncertainty. She had faced all of that with her husband at her side. And now, even alone, she refused to let a gang of cowards or an ambitious rancher drive her from the land she had poured her life into. Clara knew what everyone whispered about widows in the canyon. That they were fragile. Easily bullied. Easily bought. Easily broken. She intended to prove them wrong. Each morning, before the first rays of sunlight peeled over the ridge, Clara rose and went straight to work. She walked the perimeter of the ranch, studying every track, every imprint, every sign of disturbance. She repaired fences with her own hands, forcing the boards into place, the hammer echoing like defiance carried on the wind. And when evening came, she practiced shooting. She wasn't reckless with a rifle, but she trained with the quiet determination of someone who finally understood the stakes. Her movements were deliberate. Every shot, every reload, every adjustment to her stance carried a single message: she would not be caught unprepared again. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, offering sympathy, offering help, offering warnings. Clara listened politely, but she made her own choices. Some advised her to flee before things got worse. Others urged her to negotiate with Samuel Briggs, to strike a bargain that would grant her safety at the cost of everything she and her husband had built. But Clara Dawson wasn't looking for escape or compromise. She was looking for clarity, for truth, for the strength she knew she still carried inside her. And as she worked alone on the ranch, she found it. There were moments, small ones, when she paused. When she stood in the fields and remembered her husband's voice. When she touched the worn wood of the barn door and felt the ghosts of simpler days. The grief didn't fade, it never would, but it sharpened her resolve instead of softening it. This land held memories. It held sweat. It held love. It was the only piece of her old life that the canyon had not yet taken. And she would defend it, not for the land itself, but for the man who helped build it, for the life they planned, and for the woman she had become. The threats against her did not disappear. But they no longer frightened her in the same way. Every warning she received, every whispered rumor of outlaws lurking near the ridge, every sighting of Briggs's men watching from a distance, they all strengthened her resolve. Clara understood now that the fight for the ranch was not just beginning. It had already begun the moment her husband drew his last breath. But instead of breaking, she grew stronger. She learned the canyon's rhythms more intimately than ever before. She predicted the outlaws' patterns. She understood the motives behind Briggs's generous offer. And she prepared, not with desperation but with purpose. Clara Dawson was no longer simply surviving. She was planning, waiting, and quietly building the strength to face whatever came next. Because somewhere deep in her heart, she sensed a truth she could no longer ignore. The men threatening her weren't doing so at random. There was a reason behind the pressure. A reason behind the threats. A reason her husband's death still cast a long shadow over the canyon. She could feel the truth lurking just out of reach, a truth she was determined to uncover. And when she did, the entire balance of power in Red Rock Canyon would shift. Clara Dawson had grown accustomed to the tension humming beneath Red Rock Canyon, but even she sensed when the air shifted, subtle at first, like a warning whispered by the wind. It wasn't just the outlaws anymore. Something deeper was unraveling, something older, something carefully concealed. It started with a discovery so small she almost overlooked it. One evening, while searching through her husband's old desk, Clara found a loose board in the bottom drawer. Behind it lay a bundle of papers. Maps, land contracts, handwritten notes scrawled in her husband's hurried script. Some pages were packed with numbers, water flow measurements, and land surveys. Others were letters never sent, addressed to lawyers, land offices, even the territorial marshal. Her husband had been hiding something. Not from her, but for her. Clara spread the documents across the table, reading piece by piece, slowly realizing the threads that connected them. Her husband hadn't simply been working the land. He'd been fighting for it, against rivals who wanted to choke the canyon dry. Men who craved control over every water source and grazing patch for miles. And at the heart of it all was Samuel Briggs. The papers showed a pattern, a chain of purchases and quiet acquisitions that traced a path directly toward Clara's ranch. Briggs had been buying up land for years, pushing smaller ranchers out, one by one. If a neighbor refused to sell, accidents happened. Wells dried up. Cattle vanished. Debts mysteriously grew beyond what anyone could repay. And her husband, the man buried on the hill, had been the last roadblock in Briggs's plan. Clara knew Briggs was ambitious, but she had not known he was this dangerous. As she studied the documents, another question rose inside her, one she had never dared ask herself. What if her husband's accident wasn't an accident at all? The thought lingered, heavy and unwelcome but impossible to ignore. While the papers painted a grim picture, they were nothing compared to what Clara overheard a few nights later. She had ridden to the far edge of the property, checking a fence she suspected had been tampered with. But before she reached it, she heard voices, low, gruff, drifting through the twilight. She dismounted quietly, moving until she could make out the words. Outlaws. Not strangers. The very same gang that had been prowling around her land. They spoke openly, thinking no one was near. They talked about the ranch. About Clara. About how the boss wanted her pressured harder. About how the last warning hadn't worked. About how she'd break soon like her husband did. Clara's heart froze. Her husband? Break? What did they mean? What had they done? The men laughed, passing around a bottle, talking about another job they'd been hired for. They referenced Briggs by name, mocking him, calling him rich, corrupt, and useful. And then one of them said something Clara would never forget. She'll sell once she figures out the truth. And if she doesn't, we'll give her the same ride we gave him. A chill ran down Clara's spine, sharp and cold as steel. In that moment, every suspicion became certainty. Her husband's death was no accident. No tragic fall. No unfortunate misstep on a rocky ridge. He had been eliminated. Because he stood between Briggs and total control of the canyon. Because he refused to sell. Because he dared fight back. Clara's breath shook, not with fear, but with a fury she had never felt before. She backed away silently, leaving the gang to their drunken boasting, but her world had changed. The canyon she thought she knew was now a nest of secrets and lies. Briggs was not merely a greedy rancher. He was the puppeteer behind every threat, every attack, every shadow that had crept toward her home since the day she buried her husband. The truth was no longer hidden. It was alive. It was dangerous. And it placed Clara Dawson on a path she could not turn from. She now understood the game being played, the ruthless game her husband had fought alone. But Clara was not alone anymore. She had knowledge. She had resolve. And she had something her enemies had underestimated from the beginning. She was no longer mourning. She was awakening. The conspiracy running through Red Rock Canyon had just been exposed, and Clara Dawson was ready to confront the men who built it. Because once a secret comes to light, it casts a long, unforgiving shadow over every guilty man who tried to keep it buried. Clara Dawson had always believed that Red Rock Canyon was a lonely place, harsh, unforgiving, a land where each person survived on their own grit and will. But after uncovering the truth about her husband's death, the canyon felt different. Not lonelier, emptier. A hollow quiet hung across the valley, the kind that settles before a storm breaks wide across the sky. Clara understood now that she couldn't face this storm alone. Not because she lacked courage, but because the battle ahead wasn't a fair fight. Briggs had money, influence, outlaws, and secrets buried under years of corruption. Clara had only her determination, until the day help arrived. Her first ally came in the form of a shadow riding down the trail, slow, steady, familiar. An old lawman retired long before Clara ever moved to the canyon. His name was Marshal Everett Cole. A man whose reputation lingered like a legend told around campfires and in quiet saloons. He had once cleaned up territories known for bloodshed and chaos. A man who carried justice like it was a burden he could never set down. He approached Clara with a knowing look in his eyes. "Your husband asked for my help," he told her, his voice low, grave. But he didn't get the chance to finish what he started. Clara stared at him, stunned. Her husband had sought help, real help, and never told her. What had he been planning? Why hadn't he shared the danger with her? Cole handed her a folded letter, one written in her husband's handwriting. It was brief, but it said enough. He'd feared for her safety. He'd been gathering evidence against Briggs. He knew time was running out. Clara felt her heart twist, not with grief, but with the fierce clarity that only truth can bring. Her husband hadn't kept her in the dark because he doubted her. He'd done it to shield her from the very storm she was now facing. And Cole had come to honor his last request, protect Clara and help her finish what he could not. Cole wasn't the only one to appear. Word travels strangely in the canyon. It moves slower than wind, yet faster than intent. Within days, Clara received visits from others. Men who had worked alongside her husband, neighbors who had once been distant, ranchers who had grown tired of Briggs swallowing up their land like a plague. One neighbor, a wiry cattleman named Abel Turner, arrived with a simple statement. "I owe your husband more than I can ever repay. If you're staying, I'm staying too." Another rancher, a soft-spoken man named Jed Foster, admitted he had nearly sold his own land to Briggs out of fear. But seeing Clara refuse to bend, watching her stand tall against men who should have frightened her, had rekindled something in him. "Courage is contagious," he said, tipping his hat. "And yours has spread further than you think." Slowly, a small circle formed around her, unlikely allies bound not by obligation but by a shared enemy, a shared outrage and a shared belief that Red Rock Canyon belonged to its people, not to the greed of one man. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara didn't feel alone. Not entirely. But allies also brought questions. Hard ones. Why were these men willing to risk everything for her? What had Briggs done to them? What secrets lay buried among their fears and stories? And most of all, how deep did the corruption run? Marshal Cole wasted no time. He went through her husband's notes, studied the maps, cross-checked dates, and pieced together a pattern Clara had only glimpsed. He confirmed what she already suspected. Briggs had manipulated land rights, bribed officials, and used outlaws to intimidate anyone who resisted. Her husband had been close, too close, to uncovering it all. And that was why he died. Clara listened to every detail, the weight of truth pressing heavy on her chest. But this time the burden didn't crush her. It steadied her. It sharpened her resolve. Her allies weren't here to fight for her, they were here to fight with her. And in the quiet moments, when the canyon's wind whistled through the grass, Clara realized something powerful. The men who had once circled her home with malice were no longer the only ones circling. Now courage circled her. Loyalty circled her. Truth circled her. The balance had shifted. Samuel Briggs still had his outlaws, his wealth, and his ambition. But Clara Dawson had something he had never accounted for. A growing alliance, a righteous cause, and the unshakable resolve of a woman who refused to be broken. The lines were being drawn. The canyon was choosing sides. And the stage was being set for a conflict that would reshape Red Rock Canyon forever. The day came when the tension that had gripped Red Rock Canyon could no longer be held at bay. Clara Dawson stood at the edge of her property, her eyes scanning the horizon where the sun rose like fire over the rugged cliffs. She could feel it in her bones, the inevitability of confrontation. Every stolen calf, every cut fence, every whispered threat had been a step leading to this moment. She was ready. The allies she had gathered moved like shadows at her side, each one aware that the coming hours could change everything. Marshal Cole, steady and unflinching, carried his presence like armor. Abel Turner and Jed Foster flanked her, their hands steady on their rifles, their faces hardened with determination. Together they formed a circle around Clara, not just protection but a statement. The widow was no longer alone and the ranch would not fall. In the distance the dust began to rise. Samuel Briggs approached with all the arrogance of a man used to winning without contest. His horse's hooves kicked up the earth as if the canyon itself were warning of his intrusion. He brought with him the outlaws, the same men who had attacked her ranch, who had whispered threats, who had dared to laugh at her husband's death. But Clara's gaze did not waver. She remembered every betrayal, every challenge, every loss. She remembered her husband and the life they had built together. And she remembered the promise she had made to herself: she would not yield. The two forces faced each other across the sun-baked fields of Red Rock Canyon. Time seemed to stretch. Every second was heavy, loaded with the weight of anticipation and the unspoken question: who would claim this land and who would fall? Briggs rode forward, his voice booming across the valley. "It's over, Clara. So, live. This is bigger than you." But Clara didn't speak. She only lifted her chin and met his gaze with a steel that could not be broken. The canyon seemed to hold its breath with her. And then it began. Shots rang out, not just in anger but in precision. Clara's allies moved with purpose, cutting off escape routes, protecting the ranch, forcing the outlaws to retreat step by step. Each confrontation was tense, each movement deliberate. Clara herself took the front line, her rifle steady, her hands sure, her determination absolute. Briggs watched, fury burning in his eyes as his plans unraveled. He had underestimated the widow. He had underestimated the unity she inspired. Every ally she had gathered, every strategy she had devised, every ounce of courage she had summoned, all of it coalesced in this final stand. The battle raged across the ranch. Dust and determination filled the air. Men fell, some surrendering, some retreating, all realizing that the woman they had mocked and underestimated was unstoppable. And then, face to face with Briggs, Clara made her final move. She stood tall, unflinching, and spoke the words that had carried her through months of fear and uncertainty. "This land is ours. And it always will be." For the first time Briggs hesitated. The arrogance faltered. The outlaws wavered. The canyon itself seemed to echo her defiance. It was not just a battle of guns and grit, it was a battle of wills. And Clara Dawson's will was unyielding. When the dust finally settled, the field lay quiet. Briggs had retreated, his power diminished, his threats exposed and broken. The outlaws had vanished and Red Rock Canyon stood intact, defended by the woman who refused to be intimidated, who refused to be robbed of her home, her legacy, or her courage. Clara Dawson looked across the land she had fought to protect. The ranch was still hers, every ridge and stream a testament to her resolve. The canyon had tested her, and she had emerged not just a survivor but a guardian, a force of determination forged by loss, strengthened by allies and honed by truth. And in that moment, she understood something that went beyond victory. Red Rock Canyon was more than land. It was more than survival. It was a promise and she would keep it. The widow had stood her ground. The canyon had remembered. And the story of Clara Dawson, defender of Red Rock, had only just begun. The sun dipped low over Red Rock Canyon, painting the cliffs in shades of amber and gold. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the quiet hum of a land that had survived storms, outlaws, and greed. Clara Dawson stood on the porch of her ranch, the weight of the day settling gently around her shoulders. The battle was over but the lessons lingered. She had faced fear, deceit, and loss, and had emerged stronger than she had ever imagined. Every scar on the land, every fence she repaired, every path she walked carried the memory of the fight and the promise of resilience. Clara thought of her husband, buried on the hill above the ranch, his memory intertwined with every sunrise, every gust of wind, every heartbeat of the land they had built together. He had believed in her even when she doubted herself. And now, with the canyon safe, she could carry forward what he had fought for, not just the ranch but the spirit of determination, courage, and integrity. Her allies had returned to their own homes, their own lives, but the bonds they had formed would never be broken. They had proven that courage was contagious, and that unity could topple even the most ruthless of threats. Clara knew she would honor their loyalty and bravery with every choice she made, every action she took in the years ahead. The threats of Briggs and his men might return someday. Red Rock Canyon was no stranger to danger. But Clara had learned something deeper. Power does not come from fear or wealth or weapons alone. True power comes from standing firm in the face of impossible odds, from protecting what is right, and from never underestimating the strength of those who refuse to be broken. As the canyon bathed in the fading light of day, Clara Dawson allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She had survived. She had fought. She had claimed not only her home but her future. The land stretched endlessly before her, rugged and untamed, a living testament to the battles won and the life still to be lived. And somewhere in the wind, she could almost hear her husband's voice, whispering through the canyon, "You've done well, Clara. You've done very well." Clara smiled softly. The fight had changed her, shaped her, and strengthened her. But it had also reminded her of the simple truth that had carried her through every hardship. In Red Rock Canyon, courage is the one thing that cannot be stolen. And as night fell, the canyon held its quiet vigil over the widow and her land, a land that had been fought for, defended, and would be cherished for generations to come. Clara Dawson turned back toward the ranch house, the horizon behind her glowing with the last embers of the sun. The story of the widow of Red Rock Canyon had reached a conclusion, for now. But the spirit of her courage would linger long after the dust settled, a testament to a woman who refused to surrender, no matter the odds. And in the quiet of the night, Red Rock Canyon whispered its approval.